But we begin with our top story. The trial of Trevor MIlton in New York City has begun, and we have the one and only Alan Adler here with us this morning following this story. He joins us now. Alan, thanks so much for being here.
Good morning, guys. Good to see you. Well, the day has finally arrived. This thing is 13 months of the waiting to see what's going to happen with Trevor. There was some speculation. Maybe there would be a plea. I mean, often cases there are. In fact, the guy who's helping us cover this in New York sent me a couple cases that were pretty high profile that settled out. Why did this one not settle out? We're going to find out, but.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's kind of been 13 months in the making. We know that Trevor was the recipient of Dooner and the Dude's 2020 Turkey of the Year award when all of the news from Nicola broke. And it feels like now this is kind of drama is what we call it. Like I would use the word drama to describe what's going on with Trevor MIlton and Nicola. There's been back and forth over share votes. There's been back and forth over him selling stock. What is kind of the mood, I guess, going into the trial right now?
Well, Kaylee, not being present, it's hard to say what the mood is. I can tell you that in their last conference, pretrial conference on Thursday, that there was a lot of sarcasm and there was a lot of, tenseness, I think, in terms of the exchanges that were reported to us by our in-court reporter. And my sense is that the government is intending to make an example out of Trevor MIlton. And that means, of course, you'd have to get a conviction. The Southern District of New York is, in its own right, a pretty famous place. I mean, John Gotti's gone through there, Martha Stewart's gone through there, and countless others that have been accused of wrongdoing. When I was at General Motors, for whatever reason, the ignition switch scandal, if you will, went through the Southern District of New York. Why is it theirs? It's mostly because the Southern District is kind of the celebrity place. It is, and I don't mean that in a facetious manner. What I mean to say is that if they want a trial, they get to have it, because almost everything in one way or another connects to Manhattan and to New York. And in this case, Trevor MIlton tried to get his trial moved to Phoenix or to Utah, where he lives. Phoenix is where Nicola is based. Unsuccessful 2 times in trying to do that. The judge, Edgardo Ramos, sided with the prosecution and said, well, the NASDAQ is in New York. This is a case about, potentially, stock manipulation and trying to drive up the stock price. So it does belong here. So that's a big one to lose when you are in a district where you don't really know very many people. Now, Trevor has high-powered attorneys, some of whom actually represented Elon Musk back when he was charged with securities violations back in 2018. So he's got a top-flight crew of attorneys. But really, they haven't done that well so far in terms of getting motions through that they wanted to.
And Alan, if someone for some reason hasn't been following this story over the last year or so, what are going to be the highlight or the headline items that they need to know about going into this trial?
Yeah, that's how we set up today's story, Anthony, and I encourage people to look for it on Freightwaves Now. It's the 5 things you need to know. There's more than 5 things, but that's enough for somebody who's just passing by. I think that one of the key things that you need to look at is how big a role is social media going to play in this? Trevor MIlton was, and it was, no longer is, sort of omnipresent on social media, especially Twitter. He sort of followed Elon Musk in a certain way in terms of trying to engage his fans as well as argue with his detractors. And that, in one way or another, is going to become a big issue. There was a pretty good argument on Thursday over whether to allow the dean of the marketing school at USC in as an expert witness for the prosecution, because she's written about, the influence of social media and things like that. There was a back and forth about it. And finally, the judge said, she's in. She can testify. And I'm sure that she'll, over the time, we'll see expert witnesses from the defense on the subject of social media and the fact that it has, no real influence, which we know is not true, right? I mean, it has a lot of influence on what we do and think. So I think you got to watch for that. We talked a little bit about the venue, that is the court being in New York and why this is in New York. I think you've also got to watch, too, Nicola, which has tried very, very hard to distance itself from its founder, from Trevor MIlton, for a long time now, and has undone pretty much everything that he tried to do there. They've sort of set aside. They felt had to enter as a third party in the case. The judge allowed it and gave them a protective order against some of the documents that they possessed that Trevor wanted to use in the trial in his defense. And so that was a big blow, really, to Trevor. I guess the other thing to watch for is, how is the defense going to play out? For a long time, we kept seeing motions going back and forth about something called an advice of counsel defense, which basically means it's my attorney's fault, not mine. And, so that is not going to be the defense, apparently. That's what we heard on Thursday. But it'll be interesting to see what kind of defense they do play. Now, way back 13 months ago, when Trevor was indicted for the 3 counts of fraud, and then a 4th was added this June, his attorney said, this is the worst attack on the First Amendment ever in terms of, his right to speak freely about his company. Will that come back up? I suspect it might. It's hard to say.
So, Alan, I want to touch on that Nikola and Trevor MIlton relationship a little bit. As we know, he still owns, I think it's around 11% of the total company stake. So he still has a pretty good chunk of the company overall. What will that have to do with his relationship following? Will he be forced to maybe sell off his remaining stake and completely break off his relationship with Nikola? Or do you think that he would still be allowed to hold on to that and still kind of make money off of Nikola?
Well, there's nothing to suggest that, what the company gave him, when they went public, through a SPAC or through a special purpose acquisition company, there's nothing to suggest that there's anything wrong with his holding or that it was ill-gotten or anything like that. So I don't think there's an issue that way. I think what's very interesting, though, is that the proposal that you referenced, where Nikola wanted to raise its number of authorized shares so that it could raise money for the company, to build out the company. And Trevor opposed that. And he didn't just oppose it with his own shares, but he opposed it with the current CEO shares that the current CEO and he couldn't control together. MIlton this year had the voting rights for those shares. So he made it very difficult, although Nikola ultimately prevailed in raising the number of shares. And then MIlton, who's been selling off massive chunks of his stake, he used to have about 26%, I believe, of the company. I might be high on that, but that didn't come out right. Anyway, that estimate might be high. I think that he has almost cut in half his stake to, like you said, about 11%. I don't think anything really happens that interestingly, because this move to raise the number of authorized shares dilutes his stake and anybody who owns the shares, really. As those shares become active and are used, then there's more shares and you have to use a little different division in terms of how the shares are valued. But he recently bought shares again, which was fascinating. I looked last night, and he had sold about 3.5 million shares for $49 million back in 2021. He spent $17.4 million to buy almost the same number of shares a few weeks ago. Right. What that speaks to is that the shares have dropped in value a lot. He's trying to shore up his stake, I would imagine, from dilution.
And Alan, as you mentioned earlier, it's very likely that he's going to be an example that's going to be made out of him. Knowing that, what would be the realistic best case scenario for MIlton going into this trial?
Well, obviously, his attorneys are going to try really hard to show that he didn't do anything wrong. Now, we compare this, and we're not the first, believe me, others have done it long before us, to compare this to Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. She was convicted of defrauding her investors. This was the blood testing company back in the last decade. And so she was recently convicted. She's awaiting sentencing in October. She will be sentenced probably right around the time this trial ends. I don't think the two have anything direct to do with each other, but I think you can find similarities. And I think that, if the government prevails, I think in terms of making an example of MIlton, they want him to spend jail time. They really do. The 4 charges that are lodged against him carry 20 to 25 years each in terms of the maximum penalty. Now, that's not to suggest he would get anything near that if he did get convicted and get sentenced to jail. But I think, both sides said, no, we're not engaging a plea, because I'm sure the government, even if it was interested in pleading this out, would not do it without jail time. And I think the idea is to show other companies that are being investigated, typically SPACs, you can count them. There's a handful of them out there. Lordstown Motors is one. Canoe is one. There are a few others that have SEC and or Justice Department investigations pending. And I think the idea is, we're going to set an example here. And if they prevail, that is, the government prevails, then I think you could see jail time for Trevor MIlton.
So, Alan, really quickly, just to wrap it all up with a nice little bow, these companies that are watching, maybe these ones who are kind of on the fringes of an SEC investigation or a federal investigation, like you said, what are they looking for as a cue as like, okay, we need to do this so that they don't come after us next? Or what kind of lessons is this going to teach for those companies who are maybe kind of on the fringes of possibly doing something illegal, possibly not?
I have no idea. I would refer you back though. I would refer you back to some things that Vince Cubbage told us last week during the Autonomous Electric Vehicle Summit. I mean, he knows SPACs very well, and I think if there was chicanery, or there were things that happened that shouldn't have, and we know in the case of one or two companies, there definitely were. Then yeah, there should probably be some follow-up, whether you call it punishment or what you want to call it. I don't really know, other than this being potentially one of the bigger celebrity business trials, if you will, of this year anyway, or maybe the last couple years, that there's a lot to say about it in terms of what you can learn up front. I think people will be watching. I know we certainly will be, and our coverage we may not go wall to wall with it, but we will definitely be writing based on merits. Today is jury selection. It may or may not finish today. Hard to say. We'll have something today. And then when we get to opening statements, we'll get a much clearer idea of what they're trying to show specifically. Although I think we can discern a lot of it just from the motions that have been filed. But I think in Nicola's case, this is something they certainly probably did not want to get involved in the trial, but they felt they needed to. So therefore, there is some not exposure, but some involvement here that they would prefer to just build trucks and to not be involved in this. To the extent possible, they'll try to separate themselves from this. And one good thing is that they're going to be revealing some product in Europe next week. In Germany at the IAA Transportation Show, that will hopefully take away, for them anyway, some attention to this matter. They did pay a big fine, $125 million to the SEC, and admitted no wrongdoing. They're also trying to get that money back from Trevor, as we've talked about and written about in the past.
All right, Alan, well, thank you for being here with us this morning and for the coverage of this. We'll be watching it very, very closely here for the next month or so. Also, thanks to Alan for the word of the day, chicanery. Love that.
Yeah, I'm going to try to use it on economy lately.
All right, Alan, thanks. We'll talk to you again
guys.
soon.
Have a great day.